In this beautiful novel, Exiles in Paradise, Brigitte Adès skillfully weaves the complicated history of Islam from its tumultuous beginnings to the conflicts faced by present-day Muslims, straddling the boundaries of East and West. The novel is a celebration of Iranian culture, community, and connection, as well as a powerful integration of the nature of nationality and identity in the 21st century. Before we introduce Brigitte, I want to mention that we have acclaimed artist, author Peter Coyote with us today. Peter is an accomplished actor in more than 130 films. Peter is an Emmy award-winning narrator of over 200 documentaries, 17 audiobooks. He has written 2 best-selling memoirs, Sleeping Where I Fall and The Rain Man's Third Cure, and he has contributed to other books and publications. He is a songwriter, a guitarist, a Buddhist priest. He also has his new book, Tongue of a Crow. That is his first poetry collection. It is a Book Passage staff favorite and a Book Passage bestseller. We are thrilled to have Coyote here. He lives in Northern California. He's a very dear friend of Book Passage, a very good friend of our owners, Elaine and Bill Petrocelli. We see him often. He's like family here in the store. We're huge fans of his work. So we are so pleased to have him here today. I'm going to turn it over to Peter and welcome everyone. Thank you.
Is this mic hot? Very good. Thank you all for coming out. You have a treat in front of you. So Brigitte Adès and I have mutual friends in Paris. We're sort of part of a community. But she's quite an important person that you might not know as Americans. She's a journalist, and for 25 years she has been the bureau chief of a magazine, Politique Internationale, which is the standing of foreign affairs. It's a big deal. It's where the smart people go and they read. And she's interviewed people like Margaret Thatcher and President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt. She's interviewed Graham Greene and Arthur Miller. And now it's her turn in the hot seat. So I like to ask 2-part questions. So I'm going to start with this as an icebreaker. So I'd like to know, what is it that initially drew you to politics and foreign policy? And then what is it that made you choose the form of a novel to express your ideas about them?
Yes. Very glad to be with you.
Get close. You have to be close to
this. Oh, yeah. So, what I want to say about choosing foreign affairs is, it was interesting that I realized from around when I was 18, 19, that I really didn't really understand why wars occurred, and that I didn't think that anything that I could read in the media was really explaining this to me properly. And I really was very lost, and I think that I wanted to make sure that I would understand what wars occurred or what a big event was happening, that I would really understand. So instead of studying literature, which I was planning to do at Oxford, I did international relations. And because I wanted to understand, especially because the Lebanon War 82 started, and we were just discussing earlier the Vietnam. I think Lebanon became the problem for Israel. You know, the beginning of a war that was really destroying Israel's vision or Israel's image. And that's why I studied foreign affairs, and also, so I interviewed a lot of heads of state, and I realized how shallow it was after 30 years of doing this. Even Gorbachev, one of the best interviews I ever did, was not as fulfilling as when I met Arthur Miller or Graham Greene or all these authors. That were much more philosophical, much more in-depth. And that's when I decided, instead of writing an essay, if I wrote a book on foreign people living in our country, because there will be so many more migrants in our lifetime, and how badly they would be sort of perceived by the locals unless we really told them, explain how they are and how they think. And that's why I decided to write a novel, because empathy and mutual respect brings mutual respect. And we have to write novels because I think fiction is great to tell stories. It gives you more freedom than an essay, I've written I don't know how many long pieces of article, and it doesn't. I never have as much freedom than when I write fiction. But I base fiction on facts. My fiction,
which will be clear as we continue to talk. So one of the core structures of this story is the relationship between two young men, Farhad and Reza. And Farhad comes from a very old, very important family, and the story begins where he's looking for a kind of sacred piece of meteorite, which has been kept in a crypt in his old family house in Iran, and it becomes an important talisman to him. And he has a friend, his dearest friend in the world is someone named Reza. And as the story goes on, they're both exiles, they're both brilliant, they're both somewhat caught between a rich cultural past and a very materialistic present in Western Europe, in Paris. And so I want to know why you chose their complex relationship, which, like every deep friendship, has periods of desert, of argument, of misunderstanding, and yet there's a deep, unshakable bond between them.
Yes, I thought, because my husband from Iran has a lot of very close friends that are really dear to him, and I thought it was a very important thing if I want to describe Persian culture. And also, I think it's important because they epitomize these two people that are really full of goodwill, and they live in Europe, in the Western capital between Paris and London. They're trying to find themselves a career or fulfillment, which I find very difficult to find in France. But they because of materialistic society we have compared to their aspirations and their past. But also the fact that they diverge, their destiny diverge so fast, and because of the choices they make.
Explain those a little bit.
Yes. So basically, what they are is that they both have the same education, more or less. I think Reza is even more idealistic than Farhad. But basically, one of them decides he experiences an identity crisis from the first time he arrives he backs from his studies, and he feels that, and he's stuck in the middle of the Champs-Élysées, which is a very materialistic place, and he feels that doesn't belong to France anymore, although he thought he was going to come back to France after studying abroad, looking forward. And then he finds that he has an inner voice that he hasn't really ever listened to, that helps him find, and inner voices are very important in my novel, because if you really listen to your inner voice, you really can find different goals of what you really want to achieve. And I oppose this vision of free will and inner voice to the idea of the blind faith that religion, especially Islam nowadays, or Islam that we see, is actually too constricted. And Reza, as opposed to Farhad, who decides to go back to his roots, because renew his roots and go to Iran, because his inner voice tells him that that's what he should just, to find who he is, if he has to go back to his country. The other one, Reza, actually goes to the mosque and meets people there. Some people are great, some people are less great, some people are influencing him, and it's going to be a divergence of fate because of that. And so that's what I wanted to
let me just add what I learned from the book, is that for many young Muslims trying to find an identity and find a perch in the West, the mosque is like a complex image, because many times the imams are radical. If they're Wahhabi sects, like from Saudi Arabia, they preach a kind of intolerance and a kind of violence. So they have, some of the younger people have ideas they don't want to go to the mosque, but the mosque is also the root of their culture and the root of their religion. And I think your book handles this extremely well. I know that your husband, Nader, is Iranian, but I was flabbergasted by the amount you've learned about every aspect of life in Iran. It's staggering. I once sat down and I thought I was going to write a historical novel. And on the first page, I went to the encyclopedia so many times to find out what the character was running through the woods in the 18th century. What kind of plants were hitting his leg? What kind of rifle did he have? Who made it? And after a week of doing this, I gave up. I gave up. And I learned so much about the idea of manners, the idea of social graces, the idea of the core values of the religion. And I thought, wait, she's not Muslim. How did you learn all this?
I think I was curious, and I heard, I've been married for 30 years, so I've heard a lot about, and I liked the culture. I thought it was a fantastic culture. And what also enticed me to write about it is because I realized that I didn't know anything before I met my husband, but most of my friends, and they liked very much the culture now, but before they didn't know anything. So I thought if I write a book, I would sort of pay tribute to this culture that nobody knows and think they are Arabs. And they sort of mix everything together. So I thought, and I see Mary, who's married to an Iranian for so many years too. So that's very important to me, that I wanted to give justice to this culture that nobody knows, and it's even more important than Greek, or philosophically very important culture. So that's why. And I researched. I did a lot of research.
You did. So I spent some time, I had friends who were the sons of the Speaker of Parliament in Lebanon. I spent a lot of time in Lebanon, and I spent a good amount of time in Syria. And going there as an American and a Jewish American, I had all sorts of ideas about it. And I was just bowled over at the kindness and the civility. I mean, I interviewed Khalil Meshal, the head of the armed wing of Hamas, and he was one of the kindest, most civil, interesting men I'd ever met. So what I loved was the way you expressed the sights and scents and the facts of life, but particularly the emphasis on manners, courtesy, and hospitality. And it made me remember that when I was there, I couldn't tell people who were so nice to me, oh, you should visit my country. Because I knew they would run into a wall of hostility and wall of suspicion. We forget, I've always been a very political person, and I'm 80 years old. So I remember when the CIA was bragging about overthrowing the Iranian president Mossadegh and subverting a democratically elected president and putting in a murderous dictator with a secret police called the Savak, who ruled for 40 years, tortured people. And so we have no idea why the revolution of the mullahs took place and why they kidnapped our diplomats. But that's part of the history. And so I was really happy to see this other balance of what an ancient, stable, complex culture was really like.
Yes, it's really important to me to say that, and to show us that when he goes back to Iran, the hero actually finds that, he gets to perceive all the myriad of perceptions of the scent of the summer nights and all all the things about Iran that he remembers, but also it's a very different country. And that's a big problem with exiles, that they have an idea of their country, but it's a different country 20 years later. It's totally changed. And that's why they really never they feel American or Europeans, or they feel Iranians or Middle Eastern. They are really in between, and that's why they really need to find an inner voice to find their career. That's how my hero goes to Iran and finds, also interestingly, that these tribal people that he's heard, the revolutionaries actually have grown to become very mellow people. Some of them are...
It happens.
Everything is great. Everything is great. It's never black or white. And he learns that from going to Iran. And then, strengthened by his roots, then he can find a job that he really knows, he identifies, and he accepts to find a challenging job, which is to become the researcher for Islam radicalism, the underground networks of in the UK. And that's how the start. It becomes much more of a thriller by then. But at the beginning, it's much more contemplative, because that's how he is. He's trying to find himself.
So that was where I was going to go next. So one of the important aspects of this book for me was learning about all the various reform movements within Islam. I mean, if you read the Bible, there are sections in there about how big a stick you can beat your wife with. There are sections about how you can kill a slave. there's all kinds of stuff from 3,000 years ago that if you were to judge the Bible by a single sentence or a single phrase, it would appear like, you know, a medieval document. And so the Reform movement, if I got it right, it's Nada, known as the Enlightenment. And in the West, we're ignorant of the fact that more Christians were killed by Christians than by Romans over ideological disputes. And those same disputes are going on in Islam today. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, especially today, I would say 50 years ago, because since 50 years, the Saudis have injected so much oil money into the Wahhabism that it has pervaded all strings of Islam, and they are all sort of now, because of the money that they made, even the Barelvis in Pakistan, everything is now completely Wahhabism everywhere. So it's a very rigorous vision of Islam extremists, and it's very sad because that's what we see everywhere. The preachers in the mosques, even in Europe, most of them are teaching that you can't assimilate, they can't integrate, because it's contrary to Islam. Blind faith is the rule, whereas in the past, there were so many facets of Islam, Sufism, but also these Mu'tazilites, the Mu'tazilites. There's this very interesting people that really believe that free will is and freedom has to be part of our human experience. And we have to decide, we have to read, we have to look at the text, you have to just judge the text and decide what you want to abide to and what you don't want to abide to. But so basically there was always some different movements, and even reform of Islam existed in the past. There were a lot of different branches, and some of them were killed. And Alaj, also the Persian mystics, some of them were killed because they were saying that there was no difference between Islam and other religions. So there were a lot of things like that. But basically, what we call fitna, it's a word that is a fight among Muslims for the right vision, is something that we've seen, as we said, in Christians, in everywhere. And the reform of Islam is now a new there are a lot of people in Europe, a lot of Muslims, they want to see Islam reform, but they are afraid because they are afraid of being shot. So, but they are still, I've met the Mu'tazilites in Paris. There's a branch. In the UK, there was this very interesting center that was recently closed, but that was also trying to reform Islam. And so we have that aspect very much in our times. And we have a responsibility in the West to encourage these people. Or instead of putting them everything in the same bag and everything to these people, we have to encourage them to speak up. Because they are afraid to speak up, and they are not being protected by us.
So, I don't know if people remember, but during 9/11, year 2000, the 19 people that brought down the World Trade Center were all Wahhabis. They were Saudis and Arabians. They were not Iraqis. They were not Afghans. And it was that strict, stern interpretation of saying, it was like evangelical Christianity, you know, or some sect of evangelical Christianity that has no tolerance for diversity. And I thought your book made that very clear. It was like an education. And I think many people would be surprised to learn from your book about alternate readings of the Quran.
Yes.
How words can be translated differently, and people, as they do in America. Remember, our Christian Bible was written by the equivalent of the Warren Commission, which was the King James Version. A group of scholars got together and they decided what would be in and what would be out. It was not faxed down by God. It was written by men and women, not women at that time. So the same thing happened over time with the Quran and these books. People take, have a snake. People take a sentence and they make a religion out of it. So would you talk about that? Because I was surprised by that.
Yes, it's very important, and the hero in the book actually decides to read the Quran with his students in a very historical manner so that they can understand what's happening, what it really says, as opposed to just being in a blind faith that the mullah are trying to do. So, for example, there's a lot of words that can be interpreted in so many different ways. And like Katala, they are saying that it's like war, but it's not a war to kill people, it's a war for yourself, to be able to project, to progress. And the jihad is also a war against yourself, to be able to really fight your demons and your dark side, and all these things are very important for Muslim religion, like every religion. And you can't just put everything into literal sense, but Islam has been used as a political tool, and that's why it's just to coerce people. And that's why religion was used in the past for us as well as the way to coerce people. And religion in general is pushing the button of guilt and fear. Mm-hmm. And that's why we have to, I'm opposing what really blind faith opposite to power of the free will, because free will, if you read the text and you accept to read it and critically, you can get a lot out of it and judge it. But you're not allowed in Islam. In the Wahhabist tradition, you have to learn by heart without understanding. A friend of mine, who used to be the daughter, 11th daughter of a Muslim man who was in Marseille, she decided to buy the translation of the Quran. Her father wanted her to learn it by heart, so she had. So it must be very long too to learn it by heart. But that's what the good Muslim is supposed to do. But she said, I bought the translation, I want to see what they're saying. She was beaten by the father because she had bought the translation. So she became a Buddhist. She has a great problem. She just said, what's this? And that's what they're trying to do. And that's,
so we forget. I mean, you know, every culture has its biases. Every culture believes that the way they do things is the right way to do it. In Deuteronomy, it says, a woman may not don a man's clothing, nor shall a man don a woman's. The ancient Hebrews had a cult of snake worship called Baal. And the way they got rid of it was they killed the queen, whose name was Jezebel, and they killed all her worshippers. I mean, during the Manichaean heresies, millions of Christians killed each other over interpretations of Christian dogma. And yet we look at these other cultures and we decide, oh, they're backwards there. So I wanted to read something from your book for a minute. There's a passage on page 80, yes, about intellectual traditions. I wanted to read and have you comment on. So Farad is talking. He was skeptical of what Al-Azhar stood for, but he disliked hearing it criticized by a foreigner. And he said, was that not the very same Egyptian university which saved Aristotle's writings from being destroyed? And was it not Averroes who, by writing commentaries to those texts, contributed to their circulation throughout Europe, thus saving the works of several Greek philosophers? The school of Toledo translated Arab texts, including those of Avicenna, from as early as the 12th century. Bridges have always existed between East and West. The important thing is to keep them open, or to build on them. Of course, we're living in a time of severe obscurantism, which discourages independent thought and reasoning, but that hasn't always been the case. For instance, in Spain in the 11th century, which is where my people came from on my father's side, an intellectual advancement encouraged a real dialogue between Muslim scholars and their Greek, Jewish, Persian, and Christian counterparts. And it wasn't until the Spanish won in 1492 and drove the Moors out that the Jews were persecuted, for instance.
Yes, it's important to put this back because basically we forget that Arabs were the ones who taught us to calculate. We have so many things that Persians also had so much knowledge about things, even the human rights. Cyrus had actually, the king had actually created, there was never a slave, and they had actually written the cylinders where they say that you should know human beings are equal among themselves and all that. So it's important to put that because people forget, and we're not really in a period of obscurantism. I really believe compared to what was before, and we forget. But it's important that the Greeks, we would have lost the Greeks unless the Arabs had saved the documents and translated them. We would never have had all the Greek philosophy. So it's fascinating when you think of it.
When I was studying ancient history, one of the things that I read, which really surprised me, the Arabs invented the open arched window and running water, even before the Romans. And so in this, I remember this quote in the history book, which said, while Europeans were pissing on rushes in the corner, the Arabs were bathing in open, sunny windows, calculating mathematics, astronomy, and chess. And yet, when we look at the way we're pushed to talk to today, I grew up during the McCarthy period. And I grew up in a family that had socialists and communists in it. And I watched the government lie about my family, push people out of their jobs, break people who were union organizers, who were teachers, who were, do-gooders that maybe thought communism was a better philosophy. They were not spies for Stalin. So one of the questions I have is, when you interview political figures and they have a vested interest in a worldview, and they have a vested interest in a dogma and a political vision, how do you deal with that? Because as a writer, you see both sides.
I see both sides. What I first do is that I prepare the questions with sub-questions, millions of sub-questions. And then every time they say the dogma, I go back on that with other counter-questions. Mm-hmm. So then they have to sort of peel their dresses off a little bit. They just have to accept the counter-question and the thing. So I get a lot out of that. And because I'm lucky, because it's a very in-depth interview usually, because 15 pages long I can print, I get a lot out. But I get a bit fed up and frustrated. But for example, nowadays I don't feel like interviewing Trump. I didn't want to go. If you try to interview this man, and Johnson, Boris Johnson, although I interviewed all the prime ministers, because Thatcher, I didn't want to do Johnson, because I don't want to. It's a different type of position. Gorbachev was wonderful to interview because he was very open about everything. He was very honest about everything. But Putin, I don't think that I would get anything. Stalin, whenever Oliver Stone, when he went to see him, I just thought it was ridiculous. He was serving him the soup for I don't know how many hours he did it. He followed him, but it was fantastic for Putin to have a director from America filming him like that. I refused to. I watched a bit, and I realized he's just giving him a fantastic image by it's the wrong thing to do.
Propaganda.
Putin was delighted, of course. If you're a good journalist, there are limits to what you can do. I really think so.
Which are not limits in art.
No.
Which is why you write.
Yes, I write because of that. Because I really want.
So let me read another quote and have you comment on it. It's a quote about the relationship of your roots and knowledge and whether you should or should not disregard your culture. Like when my people came to America, they were Spanish Jews and they were Russian Ashkenazi Jews, and they wanted to become Americans. So my father was fluent in Spanish, never spoke Spanish at home. My mother was fluent in Yiddish. I have a lot of Yiddish from listening, but it was the secret language between the grandkids, between the mother and grandmother, so the kids wouldn't know. And so there was this feeling that everyone wanted to be Americans. And America meant jettisoning the shtetl, jettisoning all those old customs and practices. And so here's a quote from this wonderful book. Seeking to remain neutral, Farhad responded, "It's not a question of applying precepts, but of being familiar with them. By staying connected to your roots, you're arming yourself with knowledge. On the other hand, by disregarding part of your culture, you endanger young or vulnerable people who are unfulfilled by Western material life and may turn to religion to fill that gap. When they lack basic knowledge, they sometimes let themselves be taken in by militant Islam. You may live in Britain, but don't you still cook traditional dishes?"
I think it's very important because, sorry.
Well, so talk a little bit about the disaffection, people who come to this culture They get turned off by the materialism. I'm a Buddhist priest, many of my friends are Buddhists, Jew-Buds, people who were raised Jewish and became Buddhists. Many people are critical of some of the materialistic values, but if they don't know where they came from, they're also vulnerable to charlatans and phony gurus and all sorts of stuff like that. And I thought you touched on that well, and maybe you could expand on it.
Yes, I think you need to, it's always I'm going back always to the idea of the inner self. You really have to have your own free will, and you have to develop your own critical mind before you can just know anything. But basically, by knowing where you come from, who you are, from your ancestries, for example, it gives you the strength. Even if you go beyond it, as you did, by becoming Buddhist, you knew who you were. But nowadays, I think because of this culture, Western culture, and also the need to adapt and also to assimilate, there is a lack of that's what I like about the Persians, because they have kept really their traditions quite a lot, and they're quite proud of their culture. It's such a strong culture. But I think it's important, otherwise they get diluted and they lose who they are, and as a result they get really the praise of any charlatan. And I think the imams are very responsible, because like when the disenfranchised youth, like in Algerian French, who are really, they feel really between two countries, they don't know where they are, they get suddenly, they find religion as the way to really have a kind of a strength, and then they get completely carried away by Wahhabists who said you're not supposed to integrate. Not at all. You have to actually, they get really, that's why they end up being terrorists, some of them, because they really need a purpose in life, and the only way to have a purpose is to do something crazy, or even if it's outlawed, it's better than to be totally
without values,
diluted and neutral and boring. And if they had their own values, they knew they wouldn't be as fragile, and they would not need to fight to do great deeds that are even dangerous, like terrorism, whatever, just to exist. They would exist by themselves, by knowing who they were. And so that's why.
Well, I mean, you need an entire culture to do that, right? You need the values of a culture. You need parents and grandparents whose lives you can admire. And I can see that when immigrants often come to another country, they lose a lot of status. They may be trained as a doctor, and they may wind up as a cab driver. And then their kids see them, and their kids know how great they are, but they see them, disregarded. And it generates anger, and it generates... One of the characters that I loved in this film, in this book, is Parvez. And Parvez was Pakistani, but he was a perfect example. He was very educated, very smart, very cultured, and he ran a grocery store because that's what he could do. He had a family to support, and he did it as well as he could. And he meets Farhad, and he gets interested in Farhad's reformist struggle, and there's a mystery plot that I don't want to give away, but there are some bad actors here who are terrorists, and these reformers are trying to block them because they know that a terrorist act will sow discord and make people hate Muslims. But this is what Parvez says. So a student asks Farhad, who's the principal character, "Professor, what do you make of the surahs?" The surahs are quotes from the Quran. "What do you make of the surahs which advocate crimes against infidels? How do we reconcile this with integration?" Right? The French are saying, integrate, learn the language, don't wear the hijab, stop wearing burqas, become a Westerner. And Farhad is hesitating, he's thinking, he was bothered by these incitements, so his friend Parvez took advantage of Farhad's silence to speak out. "These incitements do exist, as many of us are aware, but they shouldn't shape our reading. Radical Islamists interpret the word qatala to mean killing, whereas it should be translated as fighting. The greatest jihad is the fight against oneself, as we're told by Surah 9, verse 5. or self-defense, set out by Sodra 2, verse 194. War is presented, and this was interesting to me, war is presented as a last resort. And in the words of the prophet, quote, it must be treated with contempt. It would be a real mistake to be put off the whole Quran merely on the basis of those misunderstood surahs. These new believers are dragging our most vulnerable children into a war against the West. This is not the message of the Quran. You can be a good Muslim without wanting Islam to become the dominant religion in the world. That idea has been much contested by many great commentators of the Quran. We have to focus on other precepts. So one of the things I was going to ask you is, in this world today of social media, of Twitter, of Instagram, where snap quotes are motivating people and making them angry, Facebook, where the desire is to sell our attention to advertisers, so they say things which will galvanize our attention. They say things that will make us angry or frightened or sentimental or curious. You've described a complicated, nuanced, intellectual questioning, which is sort of the only way to merge the two values. But it would seem that the infrastructure of our cultures, France and Europe and American, is actually mitigating against it. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
It's mitigating against it, but because we are really the beginning of this social media era and all that, I think 20 years is very small. I think it will probably, hopefully, correct itself because people will realize it's like fake news or that. I think people will have to, I think parents will have to step in and try to help their children to make sense. And what I find is that if you write narratives, hopefully that are read, that are actually showing a different vision, and if you write it with young people in it that are actually behaving, doing the right, acting bravely, trying to find a way between the two different cultures, but try to find a way forward, you can be helpful. But I agree with you that there is the timing. We are really in a very dark age of all that because of the beginning of this, and also the money injected in this information. It's crazy. I mean, the money that, like, I'm a journalist, so I used to be trustee of the Foreign Press Association in London, and the only people who were putting money because the Foreign Office stopped financing, which was a big mistake in my view, but they had no money left, I guess. They stopped financing the thing. The only person was the Arab League, and the Arab people that were injecting money so that the journalists would favor, and consciously they would favor the Arab vision, Arab vision of politics, Arab vision of religion and all that. The same with France, the Club de la Presse. It was a lot of Arabs that were putting money for that. And it's supposed to be, so of course our governments are wrong because they don't see that the importance of all this communication, which is fundamental. And I think that's really an area with the culture where governments really have to stop cutting corners. It's really very important.
So let me offer you some time to ask questions. This is what we like to do. Yes?
I came with a lot of questions, but you asked them all. No, it's a great
Well, you could buy me a cup of coffee then. I see.
Great interview. But I did want to ask you, Brigitte, to maybe speak a little bit more about Reza, the character. Was he sort of the opposite of Farhad in terms of maybe not being in touch with his culture as closely and maybe not listening to his inner voice? And is that why he got sort of pulled over to the dark side? Or?
Yeah, he's a very interesting character. I like very much Reza because he's idealistic, and in spite of the fact that he actually has thought that he should be, he wanted to be first, he wanted to be in helping poor people, he had all sorts of interests, and he was sidelined because he couldn't really find a job, which is very, very much the case of a lot of, nowadays, of a lot of people with foreign names in France and in Europe. So what he does is that he gets sidelined, but even when he realizes, I don't want to give the plot away, but when he realizes that he is actually in the wrong path, he's trying to correct it, and he's very courageous because he actually becomes a double agent in a way, which is what his best friend asked him to become, although he hates the British because he's much more, he has a very, he sees the world through the prism of his prejudices, because the Persians, a lot of Persians were very upset with the way the British behaved with the Mosque, and all sorts of things like that. So as a result, they are very, some of them are very prejudiced against the West, especially the British. And he lives in London because he's forced because of his job, and he really sees the British like that. But even like that, he wants to help them. He wants to save the people, and he's a very tragic person, in my view, but at the same time, very real one. And Farhad, at the end, realizes that he was actually quite right about the British at the end of the book, which is quite an interesting thing that you know. And Bahram, by the way, inspired me Parvez, so I'm glad to see him. Although he's not from Pakistan, but he inspired me Parvez.
Yes, ma'am.
My question flew out of my head for a moment there, but now it's back. You were saying something interesting about that maybe Western governments have more of a duty to protect or to encourage free speech within the religious movement. That it's pretty clear that there's this domination of the Wahhabist strain, but you don't see like First Reformed Church of Islam popping up, you know, and Protestant version over here. And then he touched on it as even a free, well, no, not a free speech, but a support of the press issue. So, do you have any thoughts on how the government could do a better job? I mean, we're not talking about a melting pot type of culture in France. We're talking about a very different kind of culture. What you could imagine the French government doing in terms of encouraging or some sort of countermeasures against this movement that has been so complete.
Did everyone hear that question? Because I'll repeat it if you
Very
did.
rambling. Please repeat
No,
it.
it's a good question, but could you hear in the back? No. Okay. What she pointed out was that perhaps the American government should be doing a better job to encourage democratic debate within all the religions that are in this country, so that the wealth and power of Wahhabism doesn't get to dominate the stage. And she said, you know, where's the Protestant reform? Where is the first, I forget the name of the church you said, but the offshoots, the Christian stuff. And so she was asking Brigitte to comment on that.
I think in France we've been trying to, for example, give a voice to the moderate Muslims, and they are trying to do a few things like that. But it's always very political. It sort of stays on the political level, doesn't stay into the cultural and the in-depth of the reform of Islam that is needed, because they are afraid as well of, first because now it's so pervasive that a lot of people are going to think that it's like a counter way to change the Muslim faith. And the money was so, you know, what is important is, for example, not to let foreign powers finance the mosques, not only the building of the mosque, but also the preaching. Because the priests in the mosque, or the preachers, are actually Wahhabi people that are actually been trained, and there is always a spy in every mosque to check if the preachers are saying what they're supposed to be saying, otherwise they're kicked out. I know that because I met this Muslim preacher, Imam, who actually had fallen in love with an Irish red hair, beautiful woman. So he had decided to give up. So he was free to speak, and he told me that every time he was preaching, there was this person in the mosque that was spying on him. So we have this. So I think now they are waking up, and even the Saudi prince, MBS, has woken up to the fact that they've actually injected poison in the whole system and of the faith. But it's very late in the day, and it will take another 20 years to actually get back. And we happen now.